In a survey of more than 300 published papers on music and emotion research, I found that researchers have investigated 114 emotional states related to music. Of these 114 emotions, 105 were studied less than 1% of the time, meaning that the current literature relies on about 9 emotional terms. Furthermore, 42% of stimuli were labeled as either happy or sad. When looking at the way emotion labels were operationalized across studies, I found that the terms were used inconsistently across researchers. My conclusions were that a few emotional terms, like happiness and sadness, have been used to describe an unmanageably large space of emotion, a problem that I called semantic underdetermination. I then wondered if inconclusive results from previous reviews and meta analyses were due to inconsistent use of emotion terms throughout the music community. I proposed that by using more granular terms, it is possible to minimize the problem of semantic underdetermination in music and emotion research. Which brings us to the question of what emotional granularity actually means. Emotional granularity is a psychological characteristic that describes the specificity or precision with which a person labels one's own and others' emotional states. It requires the intentional use of distinctive emotional terms and the ability to distinguish physiological responses and possible eliciting conditions that cause a subjective feeling state. In other words, it requires the ability to interpret nuanced feeling states and discriminate among them. Something that's a bit confusing is that emotional granularity can refer either to a dispositional characteristic or to a teachable and learnable skill. For right now, we're going to focus on dispositional emotional granularity. Here you see the standard circumplex model from Russell and colleagues' 1980 paper. The vertical dimension represents arousal or energy, and the horizontal dimension represents valence or pleasantness. Lisa Feldman Barrett's work showed that this circular circumplex model only applies to people with high dispositional emotional granularity. These people have multiple regions of experience, which they label with different words, such as disappointed or relaxed. People with low dispositional emotional granularity experience emotions like this flattened oval picture. You can see that there are regions of emotional homogeneity in correspondingly fewer domains of experience. In other words, they may use general terminology like I feel bad, or they may use two or more words to represent the same experiential state. People low in emotional granularity may report feeling satisfied or relaxed, but Barrett's work shows that these individuals are merely using two separate words to represent the same affective feeling. Barrett also distinguishes among two subtypes of emotional granularity. Adults high in valence focus might distinguish sadness from happiness, but not melancholy from grief. Individuals high in arousal focus might distinguish grief from melancholy, but not melancholy from tenderness. What this means is that people may perceive a wide variety of affective states in music, but they might not have conscious access or appropriate language terms for how to describe such affective states. This lack of granular vocabulary could be part of what makes music have the ineffable quality that so often is mentioned in the literature. The question, of course, is what do we do now? Let's visit the idea of emotional granularity as a teachable skill. Research by Wyden and Russell suggests that children develop an understanding of various emotions at different ages. Initially, young children may have a broad understanding of emotions and differentiate only among feeling good and feeling bad. Throughout the preschool years, these broad designations narrow to specific emotional categories. The understanding of happiness is thought to arise first. Then, children learn either sadness or anger, but they only use one term to refer to both sad and angry states. Eventually, children learn to differentiate sadness and anger and use the word sad to describe sad states and the word anger to describe angry states. This pattern of emotion category development continues throughout childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood. Adults, including researchers and participants, can learn to utilize more specificity when describing their emotional states. As one example, training in emotional granularity can result in the ability to distinguish and interpret nuanced, sad emotions like loss, melancholy, and grief. A quick aside about emotion theories. There are four major emotion theories in psychology that exist on a continuum. In previous work, I've reviewed how these theories may be applied to music and where a few music scholars lie on this continuum. The differences among these emotion theories are beyond the scope of this talk, so my point in bringing them up now is to state that the idea of emotional granularity can apply within the context of any of these four theories. Emotional granularity is most associated with Lisa Feldman Barrett, who falls somewhere in the psychological and social construction camps. Because she doesn't believe that there are any innate emotions, she conceptualized emotional granularity as a way to explain the variety of emotions that humans experience. But emotional granularity could also be interpreted through the lens of basic emotions theory. What emotional granularity means in this context is that instead of 5 or 15 basic, innate, and neurologically based emotions, a la Ekman, more granular emotion terms could imply the existence of thousands or millions of basic emotions, a la David Huron. I'll close with some of my ideas about how to incorporate greater emotional granularity into our research going forward. It hinges on three main ideas. The first is to get researchers on the same page. We need to figure out if your paper on sadness is talking about the same kind of sadness as my paper. By training researchers, I really mean finding the best way to communicate with fellow scholars and readers. In a 2006 survey, 39 international emotion experts were asked to provide a definition of the term emotion. Of the 33 scholars who responded to the question, there was no consensus. This propagates further to emotional theories and definitions of emotional terms. So the goal here would be to explain what emotions and emotional terminology mean to you, explicitly operationalize terms and list assumptions in papers and talks. Presumably, there could even be some kind of training program that researchers or experimenters could use to aid in this process. Even Lisa Feldman Barrett hasn't codified what this type of program could or should include, but I imagine it might look something like this. There are some encouraging reasons to assume a program like this could help in aligning researchers moving forward. Related to the first point, I think we need to have a better understanding of what music is being used in experiments. This second step might seem obvious to us, but when I was constructing the PUMS database, there were many times when I could not find any reference to the stimuli that were used in the study. Or sometimes the researchers provided the name of the musical work, but failed to provide information about the specific excerpt that was used in the study with measure numbers or timing information from the recording. I have a whole host of ideas about how to select and communicate musical excerpts to other researchers, so feel free to reach out at any time. Finally, we need to expand the ways we engage with participants who are listening to music. There's a ton of great work in this area already, but we can always iterate and improve. Let's pretend for a second that I am a fruit researcher. I have even developed an expertise in the subfield of apple research. As I'm writing my dissertation, I turn to my friends Lindsay, Dan Shanahan, and Josh Albrecht for help. I asked them to rate various apple characteristics on 7-point Likert scales, such as color and taste. As I'm analyzing my data, I note there is a wide standard deviation in self-reported ratings of apple color and a narrow standard deviation in self-reported ratings of apple taste. I conclude that I need to run a study with a bigger sample size to learn more about the perception of color in apples. It turns out my friend Lindsay is colorblind. Her perception of apple color is different than mine as a non-colorblind researcher, and Dan's and Josh's experiences as non-colorblind participants. Lindsay's experience of apples is as equally valid and important as my non-colorblind experiences. But without asking her to tell me about the way she sees certain colors or to describe her experiences directly, I have reduced a fundamental part of her experience to a high standard deviation. I know that's a heavy-handed analogy, but I worry that a similar phenomenon happens in emotion research, including my own work. We know that people have different dispositional levels of emotional granularity, and we also know from psychological research that different languages and cultures have their own ways of expressing emotions. For example, there is one word for anger in English, two in Russian, three in German, and five in Mandarin. Furthermore, there is not a single emotion that is known to exist in all identified cultures. Even more, while Westerners think of emotions as internal experiences, other cultures understand emotions as events that occur in between people. The implications of these findings impact the way we conceptualize research. By choosing a definition and a measurement, we are making assumptions about other people's experiences. In some cases, this is okay, but in other cases, it is exclusionary. I'm not an expert on what to do here. Tomorrow's Future Directions speaker series presentation is a town hall on anti-racism in music cognition research, led by Dominique Vouvon. I'm looking forward to hearing what she and others have to say and how we can all work together on this. An easy method of increasing emotional granularity in experiments is simply to give people more choices. By priming participants with the words melancholy and grief instead of just sadness, I learned that some people do, in fact, differentially perceive and experience more than one kind of sad emotion, and that these differences are related, at least in part, to compositional features of the music itself. We can also define emotional terms for participants, have them think about or write about different situations that make them feel an emotion like sadness, actually elicit feelings in participants using validated psychological paradigms, prime participants or use implicit testing, ask them to write as many words as they can think of to describe how they feel, give them musical examples in a training session, give them speech examples and have them extrapolate how that corresponds to music, show pictures of facial expressions and have them extrapolate how that corresponds to music. Vary the conditions in which they hear the same musical passage, whether that be giving different biographical information about the composer, before or after exercising, giving them an over-the-counter pain medication or a placebo, different levels of background noise, different kinds of background noise, or priming from a service like YouTube Roulette. And ideally, using a combination of within and between subjects designs. What my goal is here is not to pose any solutions, but to create a space where we can talk about emotion-related methodologies going forward. I have proposed that some inconsistencies among studies of expressed and evoked emotion could be a result of poorly defined emotion labels. I furthermore suggested that in order to better understand emotional responses to musical stimuli, we need to change the way that we use emotional terminology. And finally, that the way forward revolves around getting researchers on the same page, sharing details about our musical stimuli, and engaging with participants in thoughtful ways and using multiple kinds of methodologies and analyses to better understand their experiences. Thank you.